So everyone, first of all, everybody please mute yourself if you're not muted already. I wanted to welcome everybody. Good morning. My name is Patty Haskell and I'm the Vice President in charge of seminars at Calaveras Big Trees Association. Our mission at Calaveras Big Trees Association is to support and deliver high quality educational interpretive programs for Calaveras Big Trees State Park. If you'd like more information, please check out our website at bigtrees.org, or we are also on Facebook. Couple things before I introduce the speakers. Please hold your questions to the end. Please stay muted so everybody can hear. And with the slide presentation, it's best for you to go to the view, the little boxes on the right-hand side of your screen to hide thumbnail video, and that way you can see all of the slide. So hopefully you can figure that out. Today we have our first Zoom seminar. We hope to do some more, but we'll see. Entitled Giant Sequoia Forest Canopies, presented by Anthony Ambrose and Wendy Baxter. They are canopy biologists who have been studying giant sequoias since 2005. They used to work at UC Berkeley, but are now working with a new nonprofit organization called the Marmot Society. They are currently focused on a multi-year project studying the effects of fire on giant sequoia trees, water use, and vulnerability to drought and beetle attack in collaboration with the National Park Service and U.S. Geological Survey. Thank you so much for joining us, and I will let you begin.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining us this Saturday morning. I'm Anthony Ambrose, and I'm joined here by Wendy Baxter, and we're with the Marmot Society, as Patty just mentioned. Yeah, we're pleased to share with you today a brief presentation, which we've titled Giant Sequoias in a Changing World, where we're going to talk about a lot of the research that we've been doing recently in the giant sequoia forests, and what we're learning and where we're going next in our research, and what that means for giant sequoias in a rapidly changing world. Okay. So like to start off with a quote of course, giant sequoias are iconic and globally famous, and have been so for a long time. We really like this quote from Donald Culrose Peattie from a 1950 book called A Natural History of Western Trees, in which he describes giant sequoias. And he says, "The kingdom of plants has a king, the giant sequoia or California big tree. It is, as a race, the oldest and mightiest of living things. Not even in past geological times, apparently, were greater trees than Sequoia gigantea," which is an appropriate way to describe giant sequoias. So a brief outline of the presentation that we're going to be giving today. First, I'm going to be talking a little bit, just to give a brief introduction to the giant sequoias, their origins and history a little bit, and briefly just discuss a little bit of our early research that we have conducted in the giant sequoias. Next, Wendy is going to be talking about research that we've been doing the last several years, looking at drought impacts in giant sequoias. So she'll be going over that, some of the results and what we've learned. Then I will be going over a little bit more detail about tree mortality that we have recently observed in giant sequoias, and what are the factors involved in that, and the research that is ongoing that we're involved with to try and understand tree mortality patterns in giant sequoias. And then finally, Wendy's going to close off the presentation with a brief discussion about the potential future of giant sequoias and where we're headed next. So giant sequoias and their close relatives, the coast redwoods, have ancient origins. The ancestors of the redwoods and sequoias trace back to the Jurassic period, about 200 million years ago. at a time when the dinosaurs were still roaming the earth. So they're a very ancient lineage. They used to be very widespread. The ancestors of the sequoias and redwoods used to be very widespread around the Cretaceous period, about 144 million years ago. Fossil records indicate they were distributed throughout the northern hemisphere when conditions were a lot more humid and warm. So they thrived during that period. But since then, they have started to contract about 60 million years ago during the Paleocene. The fossil record indicates that they started to contract into North America. And then about 5 million or so years ago, restricted during the Pleistocene to just the western side of North America. And since then, have continued to contract with climate change, volcanic eruptions, other geologic changes that have changed the conditions suitable for them. So now they are considered paleo-endemics. They are restricted to about 75 named groves within the Sierra Nevada mountains. This map is showing the distribution of giant sequoias in yellow and their close relatives, the coast redwoods on the coast, both pretty much restricted to California. The northernmost giant sequoia grove is the Placer Grove, which you can see a tiny yellow polygon there to the east, to the west of Lake Tahoe. And then there's Calaveras North and South groves, and then Yosemite groves, and majority of the groves of giant sequoia are found in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks and Sequoia National Monument in the southern Sierra Nevada. And about 250 miles south of the Placer Grove is the southernmost grove, the Deer Creek Grove, which is a tiny grove. So, of course, the Native Americans that lived in the Sierra Nevada and the foothills were aware of and knew about the giant sequoias, but it wasn't until Augustus T. Dowd found his famous discovery tree in Calaveras North Grove in 1852 while he was chasing a wounded bear that he was hunting, that the giant sequoias became more widespread known in the rest of the world. Of course, that's a fun fact for the Calaveras Big Trees Association, that the first really widely known sequoia was found in Calaveras. Of course, shortly thereafter, there was a big boom, and a lot of people were interested in trying to make a profit and make some money off of these newly discovered giant trees. And so, the mammoth trees of Calaveras were widely publicized. They cut down the discovery tree, and you can see this photo from 1860 something, or this drawing showing on the left side a tree that they stripped for bark to reconstruct and bring around the world to show people how magnificent these trees were. And that was the mother of the forest that they stripped the lower trunk from. They reconstructed it at different exhibitions around the world. Here's a photo showing it at the London Crystal Palace in 1859. Unfortunately, that tree succumbed to fire later on in its life and didn't survive. We have been working in giant sequoia forests since about 2005, but our first introduction to the Calaveras Grove and many other groves was in 2010, when we started what we called the Redwoods and Climate Change Initiative in partnership with the Save the Redwoods League and researchers at Humboldt State University, where we established these research and monitoring sites at 13 sites throughout both Coast Redwood and Giant Sequoia groves. In Calaveras, South Grove is our northernmost Giant Sequoia grove. You can see here as the star number 9 there. So at each one of these sites, we established these 1 hectare long-term research and monitoring plots, where we mapped out the entire stand structure, all the logs, all the trees, all the shrubs and everything living above ground in each one of these plots that could be used to track changes over time. We also looked at a subset of the trees and did some intensive measurements of individual trees, mapping out their crown structure, looking at the physiology and microclimates and other things within each one of these plots to get a better understanding of the structure and function of these different groves and serve as a baseline for monitoring for the future. One, I'm sorry?
His visit with his kids was fine.
One of the things that we did in each one of these groves and these plots is to collect tree ring cores to look at growth patterns over time and correlate that with like climatic factors to see how the trees were responding to climate over time. Here's our colleague Cameron Williams collecting one of those cores from the middle of the trunk of one of our study trees. And here's a photo showing at the top a coast redwood section of one of those cores showing the tree ring growth patterns, and the bottom is a giant sequoia core showing the growth patterns from about 1900 to a little after 1960. So you can just see an example of that and what the tree rings look like. And one of the major findings from this effort was looking at the growth patterns over time of trees. And we did see kind of surprisingly a recent growth surge in some of the groves and some of the forests that we were studying. On the left here is a panel of figures from 6 of the sites in the giant sequoias from north to south. The very top one is Calaveras Big South Grove, and then going all the way down to our southernmost site, Freeman Creek Grove. It's basically showing growth patterns over time, and any point where that red trend line is above that center line within each panel is higher than expected growth based off of the allometry of trees of what we would consider average growth over time. And so you can see in some cases we didn't, and in some cases we did. So for example, in the Calaveras South Grove, that red line is right around the middle of what we would expect over time, and there's not really a big growth surge. Whitaker's Forest, not really either. Redwood Canyon, there seems to be a slight increase in the last 10 or 20 years. Giant Forest, definitely a pretty noticeable growth surge since about 1970. Mountain Home, also in more recent times, a growth surge, and Freeman Creek maybe as well. The question we have, and which is the source of ongoing study, is why do we see these growth surges in some places and not others? What are the factors involved in that? Some of our other research in these trees has shown in the tree rings that there's been an increase in the water use efficiency of the trees. So they're fixing more carbon from the atmosphere per unit water lost through transpiration. And so that's increasing their efficiency to grow with increasing carbon dioxide concentrations. Increasing temperatures might also be playing a role in stimulating photosynthesis. Changes in air quality, some other factors might be involved as well. So that's an ongoing avenue of research that we're looking at to really explain that and understand, well, how long can these growth surges continue? Will they go back down, or will they continue to accelerate? So there's some outstanding questions there. So now I'm gonna hand the presentation over to Wendy, and she's gonna talk about our research recent years on drought impacts in giant sequoia trees.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so as Anthony was discussing, a lot of our previous research in the early years was in some of the best, most pristine giant sequoia groves throughout the range. And it seemed like, at that point in time, the conventional wisdom that these trees are impervious to pretty much everything except time was holding to be true. And then in 2012 and 2016, we got hit by that hotter drought. And this figure just puts into context the severity of that drought. That center line there is kind of average conditions, and anything above is more wet than average, and everything below is drier than average. And you can see that drought during 2012 to 2016 was quite severe in the recorded history that we have. And our good colleague, Nate Stevenson from the USGS, who unfortunately just retired, he was out in Giant Forest in 2014 trying to see if he could see any impacts from the drought on the giant sequoias. And he was crawling around on his hands and knees looking at the sequoia seedlings, because he was expecting that given their small size and shallow roots, that they would be the ones suffering most severely from the drought. But he was surprised that they actually looked like they were doing quite well. But he looked up and noticed that there were a lot of mature monarch giant sequoia trees that seemed to be shedding a lot of foliage. In his 30+ year career working in Sequoia and Kings National Parks, he had never seen something like this himself. So he went back into the records of the parks and the park naturalists to see if anyone had recorded seeing something like this in the past. And he couldn't find any record of that. So it seems like, at least within the last 100 years or so, that this is a pretty unusual event to see mature giant sequoia trees like this shedding so much foliage. So he and Corin Neidick at Sequoia and Kings National Parks pulled together a group of scientists, including Anthony and I from UC Berkeley and the Carnegie Airborne Observatory, a team of scientists to take a look at the giant sequoias from the leaf level all the way up to the landscape level to get a better sense of how this severe drought was impacting the trees on an individual level and all the way up to the landscape. So what we were hoping to learn was to better understand the mechanisms of drought response in the giant sequoia trees on a individual level, and also on a whole forest level, looking at the spatial patterns of drought response across the entire landscape. And the hope was that we would be able to create maps for the park managers to identify parts of the forest that were more vulnerable to drought, so that they could allocate their limited management funds to those more vulnerable areas of the forest. So our team at UC Berkeley, we're looking at the leaf level. We were looking at leaf chemistry and the physiology of the trees. Nate Stevenson and his team at the USGS were walking the trails throughout several of the groves and visually assessing the amount of foliage dieback in individual trees to come up with estimates for how much foliage they were losing. And then our collaborators at the Carnegie Airborne Observatory were flying above all of the groves in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks to look at the trees from above using hyperspectral imagery and LIDAR. And doing that, they were able to get the amount of water that was in the canopies of these trees. So our team at Berkeley, we had 50 study trees that we climbed at different times of the year over the course of 2 years. So we would climb from the bottom of the tree and collect samples at the lowest part, and then samples at the very top of the trees. And these samples were important for our studies because this is the most stressed part of the tree. This is the part of the tree that it's hardest for the water to get to. And also, this is what the Carnegie Airborne Observatory folks were seeing from the air. So we needed to match up what they were seeing with the actual leaf samples we were collecting. So they were analyzing those samples for the chemistry and also water content to match up their hyperspectral images with the foliage samples. And we didn't just focus on the big trees. We also looked at the seedlings because we wanted to see how they were doing in the drought. They didn't seem to be showing obvious visual signs of stress, but you can't really know that until you make measurements on them. So we did measurements on these trees. We looked at the chemistry, and we also did a measurement that's kind of like taking the blood pressure of the trees to see how stressed they were. And over the course of all of the measurements that we made during different times of year in mature trees and seedlings, what we found was that there weren't really a lot of differences. And we were kind of surprised by that. We were expecting that trees that were more stressed would show higher levels of stress in those blood pressure type measurements that we were making on the trees. But what we learned after doing these measurements multiple times, different times of the day and different times of the year, was that giant sequoias very carefully regulate themselves so that they don't get into a situation where they get into trouble. If sometimes in plants, if they allow themselves to continue to lose water, it can cause embolisms in the xylem where the water is getting transported through the tree. And that can damage them and make it so that they can no longer transport water. So the giant sequoias don't want to get into that situation, so they very carefully regulate themselves to prevent that from happening. And the mechanism that they use, I know this is kind of might be a bit of an overwhelming figure here, but really what we want you to see is that there was a change from when we collected samples during the Redwoods and Climate Change Initiative, those are the red dots in the red line, to during the drought. There was a very clear change in the stable carbon isotope ratios that we measured in the leaves. And what that is an indication of is that the trees were closing their stomata, the small pores that they open up to allow carbon dioxide into the leaves so that they can make sugars to grow. In order to reduce the amount of water that they were losing, they closed their stomata so that they would not continue to lose water. And that was a very effective mechanism that they used to keep from getting to water status that would damage them. And Nate Stevenson and his team with the USGS, they walked throughout giant forest, and these little maps kind of look like gummy worms. And you can see in 2014, the more red and purple colors are areas where there was more foliage dieback, and the areas that are blue and green were less. So what they found in the work that they did was that 2014 was the year where there was most foliage dieback. And as the drought continued, the trees actually started to recover and were shedding less foliage as the drought continued and then ended. And this matched up really well with what the folks at the Carnegie Airborne Observatory were seeing. This is a map of their hyperspectral imagery linked up with the water content in the leaves. And the areas that Nate Stevenson and his team saw that were more stressed, losing more foliage, also matched up with what the Carnegie Airborne Observatory folks found, that on the periphery of the grove was the area that the trees seemed to be more stressed and losing more of their foliage. And as an overall impact, they had less water in their canopies. And the Carnegie folks flew over all of Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Park groves, and there was variability across the landscape and even within the groves. And much of this was driven by factors like elevation, distance to streams, the density of the forest. So there was quite a bit of variability across the entire landscape and within groves. So when we pull all of this information together from the different levels, the leaf level measurements that Anthony and I were making, to the whole tree level measurements that Nate and his team were making, to the landscape scale, we were able to pull together a picture of how these trees responded to the drought. So there were very important site level factors like elevation, distance to stream, that dictated how well individual trees did. And the first level of response that they made was to reduce the amount of water they were losing by closing their stomata. That's their first line of defense. But in many of the trees, that wasn't enough. So then they moved to larger scale canopy level adjustments. And that was the foliage shedding that Nate Stevenson and his team observed and documented. So for those trees that were more stressed, they were shedding older, less productive foliage to reduce the amount of water that they were losing. And in a very small number of trees, as Anthony mentioned, there were some trees that actually died. And with those trees, it seemed like severe fire damage and beetle attack were things that kind of pushed the trees over the top and actually caused them to die, which was not something that we knew could happen to giant sequoia trees. We typically, conventional wisdom is that they fall over and pretty much nothing else can kill them. But that seems to be changing. So after the Leaf to Landscape project, Anthony and I were curious to try and look into how the drought impacted their tree growth. Typically in dendrochronology, when you see smaller rings, there's some sort of environmental conditions that cause that. And typically it's drought. So we wondered, with the trees losing all of these leaves and closing their stomata, would they grow less because of this drought? And we also wanted to know how this drought compared to prior known droughts for the giant sequoias. There have been some studies in oaks that showed that that drought was probably the most severe in the last 1,000 years. And we wanted to know, was that also true for the giant sequoias, or was it a different situation for them? So Anthony and I headed out to 5 of the groves within Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. And we sampled 106 trees and collected 2 cores from each tree. And we wanted to get at some of the variability that we were seeing within the groves and across the landscape. So we collected cores from trees that were not doing well, that had lost a lot of foliage and looking very stressed after the drought, to trees that looked like they were very healthy and growing vigorously as they always have. And so we're still currently processing all of this data, so we don't have all the results in hand yet, but we've definitely noticed that there's variability within how the trees responded. So there were some trees, like you can see the upper panel of a core collected at Muir Grove. You can see those smaller rings that we were kind of expecting because of the drought. But then in other groves and other trees, that was not as pronounced, and maybe the trees didn't experience that drought in such a severe way. So there really is quite a bit of variability within and across the groves. Now I'm going to hand it back to Anthony, and he's going to delve into the tree mortality that we've seen a bit more deeply.
Thanks, Wendy. Yeah, so during the drought, more than 129 million trees were documented to have died between 2014 and 2017. Many more have died since then. The Forest Service has their aerial detection monitoring program where they flew over the entire state and estimated mortality patterns. And that's how they came up with this estimate of more than 100 million dead trees throughout the state during this drought. Most of those pines, firs, cedars in the Sierra Nevada that died. A majority of the pattern, as you can see on this map on the left, was in the southern Sierra Nevada, where conditions were hotter and drier and had higher densities of dead trees. Obviously, sequoias are a much smaller proportion of the landscape. There's a lot less absolute numbers of giant sequoias. So we would expect lower numbers of dead trees. We did see during the drought and subsequently to that, some trees that, giant sequoia trees that did die. This is one of the first ones. This photo here is a tree in giant forest that was looking like this in 2015. It has subsequently succumbed and died and doesn't have any remaining foliage. This was one of the first that we've observed to die during the drought and subsequently. And there's about 33 total trees that have died over this period that we've recorded so far. We haven't surveyed all of every single part of every single grove, but this is a higher number than the background mortality rate for giant sequoias. So it's even though it's a kind of an absolutely small number of dead trees, it is concerning that it's a much higher rate than they would normally experience. So as we started thinking about the causes of why are these trees dying, we started looking at potential beetle attack. And oftentimes you can see, as this photo shows, branches that have fallen out of the trees that are on the ground show these holes in them that are evidence of beetle entry and exit, which suggests that the beetles are attacking the tree. But the problem is branches that fall onto the ground and get attacked by beetles don't have the ability to defend themselves and fight the beetles off like a living tree does. And we weren't sure whether the beetles were just attacking branches on the ground or whether they were actually attacking branches on living trees up in the canopy. And the only way to do that is to actually go up into the canopy and find that out. And so one of the things that we've noticed about this dieback pattern in the giant sequoias is they seem to be dying from the top down. Some trees are sparse throughout their entire crown, but some, the ones that are showing signs of beetle attack, we found are ones that progressively die from the top down. And so we climbed some of these trees that we found on the landscape that were showing this pattern. We went up into the crowns and cut small branches that were showing some signs of beetle attack, some entry holes, some pitch, and some wound holes. We lowered those to the ground. Here's Corin Neidick and Nate Stevenson looking at some bark from some of the branches that we removed. We cut them into small sections, and the USGS crews brought them back to their labs and sealed them in these cardboard boxes with these little glass jars attached to them that allowed a little bit of light in. So if there were any beetles that were in the branches, when we collected them, they would emerge from the branches and then fly towards the light and get trapped in these glass jars, which we could collect and then send off to entomology colleague of ours to do some identification to verify what the species was and quantify the numbers that were emerging from those branches. So we did find some of the trees had evidence of attack. Only a very small number one tree in particular in Grant Grove that produced an abundance of beetles. We sampled that repeatedly over several years as it was dying from the top down. That tree is 99.9% dead now, or as of last year when we visited it. Many other trees showed signs of attack, but were able to successfully fend off the attack. They had very sparse crowns, but were able to successfully so far remain alive and fight off the beetles. So the culprit that we found in this, the beetle that we're seeing attacking giant sequoia tree, is the western cedar bark beetle. Phlaeocynus punctatus is the species. It's endemic to the forests of the Sierra Nevada. It normally doesn't cause a problem for the giant sequoias. It normally attacks incense cedars primarily during kind of severe drought conditions, and they're responsible for the mortality of incense cedars, but hasn't been documented up till now to be responsible for actual mortality in the giant sequoias. And so you can see on the left here is a photo looking down from the crown of one of the trees that succumbed to this beetle. The bottom right photo is a detailed close-up. They're very tiny. They're like a little less than a size of a rice grain. And then the top right is a typical gallery under the bark of where the mother goes in and lays her eggs, and then the larvae burrow around in the living tissue to feed off of. And that's the typical bark pattern of the galleries that we see underneath the bark. So we're still involved in ongoing research. We're currently collaborating with entomology professor at Colorado State and his lab to get a better understanding of the basic biology and ecology of these beetles and do a little bit more genetic work to confirm their species. They're very difficult to identify just using anatomy and morphology. So we're putting up these sticky traps in the canopy of some study sites in Yosemite and Sequoia National Parks to collect and capture the beetles as they're flying around, to capture more of them, see when they're flying and their densities. We're also collecting some more branches from healthy trees and bringing them to the ground to do some branch incubation experiments, comparing the preference of these beetles for giant sequoia branches versus incense cedar branches. And so we're helping out with that. And so there's still a lot more to be learned about the basic biology and ecology of these beetles and how that might be interacting with the tree's physiology and ability to defend themselves from them. So we know that fire is a critical part of giant sequoia ecosystems. It's necessary for their successful reproduction and the health of the forest, reducing tree densities and fuel loads. And it's a critical part of the giant sequoia forests at low to moderate severity. And that's how it's been for millennia. But recently there has been an increase in severity in some fires in the giant sequoia forest due to fire suppression. And the fires in some cases can get very hot. This photo here is showing the burned base of a giant sequoia where it actually burned through the protective bark layers and went down into the wood and partially girdled this particular tree, which we're seeing is been a trademark of all of the trees that have died have this kind of severe basal fire damage. Another interesting pattern that we're seeing in the dead trees is that they are almost exclusively located on very wet sites, which is a little counterintuitive. Places like along wet meadow edges, like shown here, Crescent Meadow and Giant Forest, streamside locations, areas that they have saturated soils, are the places where we're seeing the tree mortality in the giant sequoias, which is a little confounding and a little counterintuitive. We know that giant sequoias need an enormous amount of water. We've measured how much water is flowing through individual giant sequoia trees, and documented the most water of any tree species on the planet. They can transpire or use or transport about up to 1,000 gallons of water a day, up to 4,000 liters a day through a single individual tree during a summer, which is more than any other tree on the planet. And it's simply a function of their size. The more sapwood area that's transporting water, the more leaf area that they have that is transpiring that water to the atmosphere, requires an enormous amount of water to sustain them. The one question is, though, where do giant sequoias get all that water? Sequoias are typically considered to have very shallow roots. They have a taproot when they're seedlings, but that kind of atrophies and disappears as they get older, and they don't typically have really large roots that go more than a few meters deep. This photo is showing a tree that tipped over during this year's mono wind events in the Mariposa Grove in Yosemite National Park, where we just visited. And you can see the upturned root system there is very shallow. The deep roots don't go very deep, but there might be some fine roots that go deeper that can supply the water that they need to sustain themselves into the dry future that wouldn't be detected by overturned root stumps, root wads like you see here. And you can see it's notable that there's some standing water underneath that in that pit where the root base was. We know that giant sequoias don't like really wet roots. They don't get enough oxygen, and it atrophies, and it potentially introduces rot in the roots. So on very wet sites, they may not want to go very deep because of that saturated soil. But the question remains, where are they getting all their water? So Wendy and I left UC Berkeley a little more than a year ago, and we started our new nonprofit research and education organization called the Marmot Society, which is inspired by the marmots that we saw while we were working in Giant Forest during the drought and the Leaf to Landscape project. If you want to learn more about us, our website is marmotsociety.org, and feel free to contact us if you have any questions or would like to learn more about the work that we're doing and plan to do going forward. The first project that we have worked on and started with the Marmot Society is something we call the Giant Sequoia Fire and Water Project. And it's building on the research that we've been doing over the last decade or so, and moving forward to address some of these critical questions and the patterns that we're seeing now with drought response and tree mortality. And for the Marmot Society, it's a collaborative effort between the Marmot Society and the Park Service and the USGS and Colorado State and UC Berkeley. But the Marmot Society, our part of the project, is primarily focused on two different questions. The first being, what are the effects of fire on giant sequoia tree water use? And secondly, how does this influence tree vulnerability to drought and beetle attack? So our working hypothesis right now for this is that wet site trees have shallower roots than dry site trees, which makes them more vulnerable to drought and fire. You can see on the right side, it's showing a depiction of the rooting depths of trees that are growing on wet sites that also have some recent fire scarring. We think that they have really shallow roots, and during normal conditions, average conditions, that is enough to sustain them because the water table's high. But then during an extreme drought, like what we saw in 2012 through 16, that water table drops and it kind of leaves their roots a little high and dry, and they don't have enough water to sustain themselves. And that's what made them more stressed and vulnerable to beetle attack, that they couldn't fight the beetles off like they would normally. And of course, the degree of scarring from fires makes a difference as well, because that also prevents water transport up the tree. Another factor that is part of this is the shallower roots might be more vulnerable to fire damage from the fire actually burning closer to the surface. And another factor might also be that they might be more vulnerable to root pathogens, which is something that we need to look at going forward into the future. So we're doing this project in Giant Forest in Sequoia National Park, as well as Mariposa Grove in Yosemite. We have 65 study trees that we've rigged and have been collecting samples from starting last July. And we just did our first sampling this spring a week ago in these trees. We've selected trees in wet, very wet kind of streamside, meadowside conditions like you see on the left there in the photo, to very dry kind of ridgetop rocky sites that would normally be considered very drought prone, like you see on the right side there, as well as some intermediate mesic sites that we randomly selected throughout these areas. And so in each of these forests, all of our study trees are located within planned prescribed fire areas. And so we're collecting samples before and after fire to compare how trees are responding to fire. Hopefully, at least in Giant Forest, they may be burning within the next couple of weeks within this area. And it's called the Tharps burn area. Mariposa Grove, it's a little more uncertain when they're going to be able to burn, but we're going to continue to get our samples until they burn and then continue after that as well. So we're doing a number of different things as part of this. The first thing is we're collecting tree cores. You can see in the top left there, Wendy about to collect a core from 10 meters up on the trunks of our study trees. What we do is we collect a core just of the shallow xylem, the sapwood section that's transporting water. We collect those, bring the samples sealed in tubes back to the laboratory and extract the water out, and then look at the stable hydrogen and oxygen isotope ratios in the water to get an isotopic signature of the water that's the trees are actually using. The next thing we're doing is we've installed in a subset of our trees in Giant Forest these sap flow monitoring systems at the treetops to measure actual real-time water movement along with the microclimate conditions that are driving the transpiration of the trees. And so every 10 minutes, these data loggers are automatically recording the flow of water through the trees. And so we can see exactly how the trees' water use patterns are changing under different environmental conditions, and then before, during, and after fire comes through. We're also collecting precipitation samples, rain and snow, as well as groundwater and stream water to identify the stable isotope ratios of potential sources of water for the trees, as well as soil samples going down different depths to be able to see whether they're getting shallow versus deeper soil water, and how that might compare before and after fire, and how that varies across the landscape from very wet to very dry sites. So we're still analyzing our samples, and that's going to be an ongoing research that we would be happy to share in the future when we have some results to share. Another thing that we are just now in the planning phase with the Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks is collecting seeds and cones from giant sequoia trees to preserve and archive and document the genetic diversity, particularly in areas that have been burned by fire, where seed sources might become compromised if the fires become too severe. So I'm going to hand it off now to Wendy to talk about the future of giant sequoias.
Yeah, so, we all know that we're living through an era of rapid change. And as Anthony discussed, fire and water are really important parts of creating a healthy giant sequoia forest. But these things are changing as the climate warms. So what does that mean for the giant sequoias going forward? Just by the nature of their presence in these locations, we know that the spots where giant sequoias are growing are locations with abundant, reliable water. they couldn't grow in locations for thousands of years without that. So they're kind of an indication of a hydrologic sweet spot on the landscape. But the question is, for how long? How long are these locations going to be able to support so many big trees that require so much water? We know that the temperature is changing. Most of us have experienced that during our short lifetimes, and projections towards the end of the century indicate that in the areas where the giant sequoias grow in the Sierra Nevada, we're going to see several degrees of warming over that time. And that's going to have impacts on the water and fire regimes for these massive organisms that we all know and love. As many of you, I'm sure, are very understand very well, snow is a really important source of water for the giant sequoias. The vast majority of the precipitation that arrives in the giant sequoia forests arrives as snow, or did in the past. And the thing that's so good about snow as a source of water is that it accumulates during the winter, and then it slowly melts into the system during the spring, and that kind of helps subsidize the trees over the dry summer when no rainfall falls. But these days, more of our precipitation is arriving as rainfall, and our snowpack is melting a lot earlier. So this is a satellite image from late March, and you can see our snowy Sierra Nevada mountains. But already in early May, most of that snowpack has dwindled, and you can see that the foothills areas that were previously green, I'm going to go back to that previous photo so you can just see all the nice green in the foothills areas, is already brown. So it's looking like we are in another drought year. Currently, we're at 5% of normal for our snow water equivalent. So that means that there's going to be less water available for the giant sequoias at the end of the hot, dry summer. And the US Drought Monitor Index shows that most of the areas where the giant sequoias grow is in extreme or exceptional drought already this year. So it looks like we're gearing up for another drought year in the giant sequoia forests. Another important factor that Anthony was talking about for the health of the giant sequoia forests is fire. And I'm sure most of you were affected by the severe fire season we had last year. One of the big fires that occurred was the SQF complex, and that burned quite a large proportion of the giant sequoia groves on the landscape. And this is a map that was put together by the Save the Redwoods League, kind of showing the severity of the fire in different areas. And there was a lot of variability across the landscape. Several giant sequoia groves, the entire grove, for many of them, was impacted by fire. And some of the groves actually burned pretty low severity. So those might actually end up being pretty good fires for those groves that needed them. And it might reduce the number of small trees growing to reduce the density. It will reduce the amount of fuels on the forest floor, and it will also help the regeneration of giant sequoia seedlings. But in other areas, the fire was pretty severe, and it actually killed mature giant sequoia trees and may even have impacted the regeneration of seedlings. We have some colleagues who went out from the National Park Service to a number of the groves within Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks to get a sense of what things look like on the ground. And this is a photo taken at Board Camp Grove, and this is one of the areas that burned quite severely. And you can see that there aren't the characteristic green seedlings carpeting the forest floor that you would expect after a fire. So they're certainly were some areas that did not get a good fire. They actually burned too hot. Here's a photo from Mountain Home Grove of a very special tree to Anthony that he's climbed in the past, the great bonsai tree. That doesn't look like it survived the fire. But then other parts of the forest may have received a lower severity fire that actually was a good thing. So it's kind of a complicated story, and it depends on which location you're in. So we know that giant sequoias are incredibly resilient. They can survive fire, they can survive drought, they can survive lightning strike, massive winter storms. This photo on the right is a tree and giant forest that Anthony and I really like. It's just a great emblem of resilience. You can see that it has endured a number of fires, and it's still growing and trying to persist. But they also are vulnerable because of the large amount of water that they need to survive and grow, and because they've already been restricted to such a small range. Thinking back to those figures that Anthony showed at the beginning of the previous extent of these trees, now they're really restricted in these tiny little areas within the Sierra Nevada. And if conditions don't continue to be good in those groves for the trees, they might not be able to continue to grow there. So what are some things that we can do to help these amazing trees and forests grow and persist into the future, which is something that we are all dedicated to. I know you all are passionate about these trees as well. Prescribed fire is one of the biggest things that we need to make sure is happening. We know that Calaveras has a very active prescribed fire program, as does the National Park Service, but it's really tricky having all the conditions align so that these prescribed fires can go forward. It's expensive and time intensive, and it's really hard to treat the total area of land that needs to be burned. So we really need to ramp this up and keep getting the forests burned that haven't burned recently. Another thing that we can do is manual fuel treatments. So going in and cutting out smaller trees. This is something that can be done in many times of the year, so it's not as restrictive as prescribed fire, and it's a way to reduce the fuel loads in these forests that have become too dense. So that's another really important thing that we can do to try to make these forests more resilient. Another thing, as Anthony mentioned, is preserving the genetic material by going out and collecting seeds. Especially before a catastrophic fire comes through an area that maybe hasn't burned for hundreds of years. If we can get in there and collect cones and have those seeds on hand in the instance that seedlings aren't growing, and we need to facilitate their regrowth by putting seedlings out on the landscape. Another important thing is just more monitoring and research, so we have a better understanding of the mechanisms of how all of these complicated factors are interacting and developing as our climate changes. It's just important so that we can direct limited management funds towards the things that are going to be more effective. And finally, we really just need to address climate change. It's going to be challenging for us to keep these forests surviving in the way that they have in their beautiful majesty if we don't actually deal with the issue of climate change and curb the warming that we're seeing. So thank you all so much for all that you do, all the information you share with visitors, and the enthusiasm and love that you have for the giant sequoias. Thank you for your interest in what we've been doing. And now if people have questions, we'd be happy to answer and open up everything for a discussion.
Can I speak up?
Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Roger Mosley, even though it says I'm Sarah Dreesen. That's my daughter. I actually have two questions. One quick one. Have any core samples been taken in Calaveras Big Tree State Park?
Yes, yes, we collected from, I think, 6 or 8 trees. Yeah, and so yeah, and if you want, I can send you some papers that present the results of the dendrochronological analysis of those cores. One of the growth surge figure that I showed in the beginning of the presentation presents some of those results.
That was as part of the Redwoods and Climate Change Initiative. So that was before the drought that those cores were collected.
Yeah, we collected those back in 2010.
Okay, and
I
then
posted a question. How do you define a growth surge? How do you measure growth?
Well, we look at the tree ring growth patterns and the width of the rings, and then using measurements of the whole tree crown, we estimate how much wood volume is being put on each year by just using geometric calculations to calculate the volume of wood being put on each year by each tree. And the growth surge it's not exactly a precise term. It's more, are they growing more now than we would expect given normal growth trends under constant conditions? And so some of those figures that I showed, some of the groves and some of the trees are showing higher than expected growth rates in recent decades. Other places are not showing that. So that's kind of what we're saying is a surge. Whether that's continuing, those, like I said, those cores were collected between 2012 or 2010 and 12. Whether they're continuing beyond that and how much longer those surges might continue or not, it might just be a temporary thing. It might we know because water is such an important factor that even if the trees are able to take advantage of higher carbon dioxide concentrations at some point, they will become limited by water. That it doesn't matter how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. Temperatures might just get too hot, and that might affect their photosynthetic enzymes. Also, water just might not be available to sustain the growth rates that we're seeing. So that's still an outstanding question.
my second question is that, I do a job we call Trail Patrol at the Big Tree State Park, and meet a lot of people there. And when we talk about climate change, a lot of people ask, what can I as an individual do about climate change? Do you have any suggestions for an answer?
Well, reducing your own carbon footprint is an important step. Supporting policies and politicians that, first of all, acknowledge that it's real and happening and that we're the cause of it is another step. Also supporting policies that reduce fossil fuels emissions on a collective society level is important as well. It's hard to put all the responsibility for climate change on an individual, but everything we do does make a difference. And if we support larger structural, systemic, societal, larger economic policies and programs that address it, reducing subsidies for fossil fuel companies, for example, those are all important steps that we can take.
Great, thank you.
Welcome.
I have a question. I'm okay?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Hi, I'm Frankie, and I was interested in the slide that you showed of the core samples looking at the drought period starting in 2014. And it seemed like the first couple of years, the growth was restricted. The rings were much narrower, and you talked about the stomata closing so that the water wasn't lost through transpiration. So, they're also not getting CO2 in as much. So, but then in the later years of that 4-year drought, there was normal looking growth rings. So they still aren't getting more water. I just wondered if the you said you were looking at physiology and the leaves and things like that. Have you seen anything from a physiologic perspective? Are they, upregulating certain genes that, I mean, how are they able to grow at a normal rate when they still don't have it, when the drought was still going on? Or is that something we don't know?
We still don't know, and those are excellent questions. There's just so much about these trees that we still don't really understand and know. Because they're such massive organisms, it's possible that they store carbohydrates that they can then use at later periods in time. They may also be able to store water that they can get access to. So there are a lot of things that we still don't really understand about the trees. And there are certain studies that you could do to try and get at that, looking at how the tree is allocating its sugars to different kinds of growth, because the root systems are incredibly important, as well as the trunks and also the leaves. There may be different things that the trees will allocate their precious resources towards during periods of drought, and that's something we don't understand yet.
Yeah, another factor is that the return of those larger growth rings that we showed in that one photo, that was when actually 2017, 2018 was a above average water year. So conditions improved. So, the trees hunkered down, those trees that did show reduced growth during the drought, 2014, 2015 primarily, they kind of like just hunkered down. They shed some foliage, they shut their stomata to protect themselves and their long-term structural integrity and ability to transport water. When conditions improved, they kind of like went back to normal and started growing again, like they did before the drought. So, that's just another testament to how resilient these trees are, that they can deal with short-term impacts like that and then kind of recover, maybe grow some new foliage and, get back to what they were doing before the kind of the tough conditions. The question becomes, if that really long-term drought like gets to be, a mega drought, like 20, 30 years, are they able to withstand that and hunker down long enough to be able to recover from that? And that's something that we don't know yet.
Okay, thank you. That was really interesting. And if you have time, can you just kind of mention what it's like to be up there and how, I love those pictures of people hanging off the side of the tree. How, like technically what you do when you're going to go climb up there?
Sure, yeah. Well, first of all, it's just amazing getting the opportunity to climb in those trees. Each one is so unique and different. They have such unique character just because of where they are growing on the landscape. The lightning storms they've endured, the winter storms they've endured, the fires. They just have these amazing and unique characters to them. And getting to be up in one of those trees is a really special experience. And every time we do it, it never changes. It's always a special thing. And one of the things I really love is going through some of the branches midway up the trunk, because they're really huge at that point. And you get a real sense of how big these trees really are when you see yourself next to one of these branches that, sometimes are as large as cars. It's kind of mind-blowing getting the opportunity to climb up in these trees. You want to tell them about how we get up there?
Oh yeah, so we use rope-based arborist techniques. We don't use spurs or anything like that. To initially get into one of these big trees, we use a crossbow that has a fishing reel attached to it. And we shoot some arrows high up into the crown over some sturdy branches, which is trailing the fishing line. And then we use that to pull in a little nylon cord, which is strong enough to then pull a rope in, a climbing rope, which we anchor one end and then climb the other using mechanical devices. And then we use kind of ropes to work our way around the trees.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a lot of work, but it's very fun. And as Wendy says, it's very special, and it's a humbling experience to, it's amazing on its own level to just walk to the base of one of these trees and be up against the base of it. But it's a whole nother thing when you're up there amongst the crown and it's a very humbling experience to know that, you know, in some cases, some of these trees that we've been studying are 2,000-3,000 years old, have been growing there for that long, and these massive structures that feel like they're these solid, you know, impervious things, but they're actually living beings. It's amazing.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other? In the chat, there's a question. Somebody asked, what about Metasequoia in Southeast Asia? Yeah, we didn't mention that. The Metasequoia glyptostroboides is the dawn redwood, which is the closest living relative to the coast redwood and giant sequoia, which is found in interior China. Cool thing about them is they are deciduous. They lose their leaves in the wintertime, unlike the sequoias and coast redwoods, which are evergreen. But yeah, another relictual species that was once actually thought to be extinct, and then they rediscovered it. Another question somebody asked is, did all the trees in Mariposa Grove that fell topple in the wind because of too much water? That's a good question. Certainly some of them probably, because they had shallow roots because of the water depth. Probably that was a contributing factor. I don't know if anybody's done any like analysis or survey of the trees that fell and whether they were all in wet sites or not, but it seemed to be kind of a pattern, but not all of them.
Yeah, there were also a lot of trees in Wawona, just kind of all over that
Pine
general area
trees.
that fell over. But yeah, definitely having saturated soils can make the trees more vulnerable to falling over.
Yeah, they were extreme wind events, a very
Mhm.
unusual wind event that toppled all those trees. So any other questions?
Do you have a website where we can view this presentation?
Not this presentation, but we know that it's being recorded. So I think you will have access to the recording of this if you would like it.
Yeah, I see that now. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Anybody else?
I just wanted to thank you guys for the science that you presented. We often hear talks about how beautiful these trees are, which we all love and agree with, but it's great to get some of the scientific background that you presented, and I really, and I know everybody here appreciated that a lot, so thank you.
Great, thank
It's
you.
our pleasure. And
Yeah.
thank you for the work you are doing
Yeah.
and educating visitors and helping to protect Calaveras. It's a very beautiful forest. We really
Yeah.
love it there.
Yeah, we love working there.
Well, thank you so much for coming. So everybody knows I've already asked them to come back next year in the spring, hopefully in person, so we can catch up on their research then. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Pleasure.
Patty.
And thank you for everyone joining us.
Thank you
Thanks.
all.
See ya.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you so much. It was
Care.
great.